Hello, viewers. This is your host, Gabriel Buelna, with Buelna News. Welcome back, and today we're excited to have our guest, Dr. Alvaro Huerta. Welcome, Dr. Huerta.
Gracias. Buenos días para todos.
And before we get started, if you haven't yet, please subscribe to Buelna News. Just click down there. We appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, share it. But subscribing to the channel is very important to us. So I want to urge that, and let's get going, Dr. Huerta. And again, thank you for joining me today. Let me do a quick intro. Dr. Alvaro Huerta is an associate professor in urban and regional planning and ethnic and women's studies at Cal State Polytechnical University, Pomona. Among other publications, he's the author of the book Defending Latino Immigrant Communities, the Xenophobic Era of Trump and Beyond, published in 2019. He holds a PhD in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley, along with a master's in urban planning and a BA in history from UCLA. Anything else that might be important for our viewers to understand about your background, Dr. Huerta?
I was raised in East LA.
In East Los Angeles.
I was raised in East Los Angeles, and I was a former community organizer for many years before I returned to graduate school.
All right. So, Dr. Huerta, in your book, you reprint an article by the late Dr. Juan Gomez Quinonez, a really great academic in Chicano history, really transitioned our community. The article is titled La Realidad, The Realities of Anti-Mexicanism, a Paradigm. I'm going to take a second to read how he defines the concept of anti-Mexicanism. He says, U.S. anti-Mexicanism is a race-premised set of historical and contemporary ascriptions, convictions, and discriminatory practices inflicted on persons of Mexican descent, long-standing and pervasive in the United States. Mexican Americans are a bottom ethnic group, and unless there are changes, Mexicans will remain so, even in a multi-ethnic and plural society, including white Latinas and Latinos. This may be the case even in the United States, even if the United States becomes a significant demographically non-white society. This is a consequence in part to the diffusion of anti-Mexicanism to all sectors of U.S. society. It is not only taught to whites. Tragically, Mexicans also consume anti-Mexican propaganda and in turn produce and diffuse it consciously and unconsciously. Thus, anti-Mexicanism must be challenged for the sake of the future, not the past. It must be challenged for a society in which children will be safe from past crimes. So, Dr. Huerta, why did you include in your book, again, Defending Latino Immigrant Communities, why did you include, especially at the beginning of the book, the article by Dr. Juan Gomez Quinonez?
Yes, thank you for that. Well, Dr. Juan Gomez Quinonez recently passed away, and he was my professor in the early 80s when I was a history major at UCLA. And this essay originally was published in Huffington Post that I helped publish for him, and I did some edits for Gomez Quinonez. And the essay itself is worth just buying the book. I mean, I think this essay,
I agree,
is pretty much like the best essay that I've read in my life in terms of in a few words that he encapsulates so much of the sentiment of anti-Mexicanism, something that we don't hear about in the media. We hear about anti-Blackness, which is something that I campaign against, obviously, but we don't hear anything about anti-Mexicanism. And the fact of the matter is that when you have one of the leading theoretical historians in the world, not just among Chicanos, but among all historians, put that in the forefront of discourse, to me, I was compelled to set the record straight in terms of, for us, as those of us who are of Mexican origin, we need to also fight and make the case that we too have been oppressed to the present. And by setting it in the beginning, it just sets the foundation for the rest of the book as a theme of anti-Mexicanism that's pervasive. And we see this with the election of Trump. Trump got elected partly because of him attacking Mexicans and the wall and scapegoating us. So for Juan Gomez Quinonez to write such an article, and it's very challenging to read. I mean, it's not easy. I reread it yesterday to prepare for this interview, and I had to reread it a few times. So it's not something that you could just read and then I understand what he's getting at. But it takes time. But once you get to the essence of what he's arguing, I think this is important that we all need to argue for.
But Dr. Huerta, what is the essence of what he's talking about for anyone who is Mexican American, Latino, anyone who's watching? What is the essence of why he's saying and why it's important to us?
He's really what he's really getting at is anti-indigenous. That America is against the indigenous, and the Mexican as a people, we are primarily indigenous. So it's pretty much he's arguing the European colonization of Mexico primarily against the indigenous population, and that for those of us who are Mexican origin, that's where we come from. So it's an ideology of colonial ideology of white supremacy against the indigenous populations of America, in this case focusing on Mexico. So it's very pervasive, and it's not something that is understood because we see a racism in America as black and white, and it's not. We see racism against Native Americans, against Asians, and in the case of Mexicans, it's been pervasive since day one.
But Dr. Huerta, I understand what you're saying, but if you're Mexican American, seventh generation, eighth generation, your family was here since 1848, and you experienced that, right? Why is anti-Mexicanism? Is it anti-Mexican Americanism as well? What does anti-Mexicanism encapsulate?
No, that's an excellent question. I'll take my case. I was born here in Sacramento, but I spent the first 4 years of my life in Tijuana. And then we came back to the United States. So I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm an American. But for most white people, especially the racists, not all white people, because it's not about race itself, but it's about racism. They don't view me as an American. So they view me as a Mexican. So that's the perception. And that perception, they when you turn on the TV, when you watch a movie, it's always brown people are considered Mexicans and inferior. So there comes a point where, Juan Gomez Quinonez talks about how even us of Mexican origin, even though we're American, we internalize this anti-Mexicanism, like this self-hate. Because from day one, we've been taught in our schools, in Hollywood, on TV, to hate ourselves, that we're less than, we're inferior. So that even though we're born here, we're still not considered American citizens. We're not considered first-class citizens. We're considered second-class, third-class citizens. So this is why it's important, is a way of identifying the problem and then defending against it.
So when folks say anti-Latino racism,
right?
Latino, of course, is a pan-ethnic term. So before we get to anti-Latino racism, or can you get to anti-Latino racism without first going through anti-Mexican racism and understanding it?
Yes, well, a lot of it is based on geography. Traditionally it's been the Southwest, but now we see that the case of the Mexican, we're in the South, we're in the East, we're everywhere. We're even in Canada, in Alaska. So the numbers speak for themselves. The majority of Latinos and Latinas in the United States are of Mexican origin. So, we're the largest population. There's a lot of emphasis, there's a lot of talk on Cubans, but they're a small population and they're relegated mainly to Miami and Florida. So at the end of the day, the argument is really one that should be centered on the question of the Mexican, predominantly because that's the group that historically has been discriminated against and targeted, not just by taking half of our land in the mid 1800s and early 1800s with Texas, But also during the Great Depression, the Mexicans were the ones that were deported, over 2 million. In 54, the Bracero, in terms of Operation Wetback, another million deported. So we've always been a scapegoat. So for what I argue is that I'm supportive of Central Americans and others in terms of their plight. So there's not a but there. My argument is always we need to center the argument in terms of who has been the group that has been targeted, and in this case, been those of Mexican origin.
But just to clarify, because this is important for conversations that have occurred since you and I were students in the 80s and the 90s, is I think what you're saying is if you're of Central American descent, if you're Salvadoran, Guatemalteco, if you're Puerto Rican, Dominican, Cuban, if you're to understand any type of racism that's occurring to you, you have to understand anti-Mexicanism in order to understand what's occurring potentially to you. Am I wrong?
Yes. Definitely, especially the question of the indigenous.
Right.
You see this. I mean, we know how grotesque Trump is and how uneducated and confusing the way he speaks. But you have people that taught at Harvard, professors like Samuel Huntington, that full professors wrote books and articles. He wrote an article focusing on this idea that the Hispanic challenge, that we were a threat. And then within that article, I mean, famous political scientists, within that article, he argues and focuses on the question of the Mexican. So at the highest levels in higher education, in terms of theory, and he didn't even hide it. He literally attacked the Mexican, that we were the problem. And part of it was challenging this idea that the Anglo, was founded America. The Anglo is from England. The Mexican is inferior because he's Catholic and he's from Mexico and he's indigenous. So he did this contrast. And you see how this will be manifested in other groups. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some Afro-Latinos where the case is not necessarily of indigenous, but more the anti-blackness. So that also exists as well. It's like this is parallel. So to me, it's not like one or the other, is both. But when it comes to Latinos and Latinas, primarily we're mainly of indigenous origin. Obviously, those of us who have Spanish blood, or some of us who literally just came from Spain. But at the end of the day, it's a question about the Mexican in America.
Majority indigenous. So let's go on. And we're here to talk about your book, but I want to mention another author and connect, then move on to because you have dozens and dozens of stories, and I want to get to some of them. So Dr. Laura Gomez speaks about a double colonization, and that this means that various racial groups who inhabited the region in the mid-19th century were forced to navigate two different regimes of racism simultaneously. First, Mexicans and Spanish in the Southwest, then the American system. And she means that Mexicans and other Indians negotiated the American racial order in the shadow of kind of Spanish and Mexican racial order. So, and she talks about this in the book. So my question is this complex system, which Laura Gomez talks about multiple colonial systems for U.S. Latinos, is this the reason why Mexican Americans and Latinos aren't comfortable discussing race?
Yes, I think so. And part of it also has to do with wanting to be accepted and wanting to be, we see this in World War II where Mexicans went to fight and defend America, and then they came back and they were treated once again like they were second-class citizens, but always wanting to be accepted, and this idea of not wanting to get into the question of race, of more so of wanting to integrate and to be part of the system. But there is this parallel, this hierarchies, and a lot of this is imposed by Spain and the way of looking at race and try to put like a social order where the lighter skin that someone is
Are we
superior.
still in that social order? Do you think is it unconsciously still in the Mexican American Latino mind?
It is, unfortunately, it is, and it's something that when we listen to the words of Juan Gomez Quinonez, it has been internalized, and those of us who are lighter skinned are considered more beautiful than those of us who are darker skinned. We see this in novelas in Mexico, and these novelas are shown here in the United States and throughout Latin America, where you see the protagonists are white, light skinned, they're thin, and then the indigenous are inferior. They don't even speak the language. They have they're caricatures. So a lot of this we internalize it, and it manifests that way. And then for a lot of people, they don't want to be. For a lot of Mexican Americans, they don't want to be considered that. They don't want to. They want to be part of the system, but at the end of the day, they can't get away from it because it's not a question about race. It's a question about racism, and we're still under that purview.
So moving on to a lot of the other articles that you write, I want to first get to the style. So you chose a short writing style, meaning a book with a lot of short stories. Can you tell us why you chose that style and why it's important for you to write in that way, and what was the intended effect?
Yes, thank you for that. I was originally a math major, so I started UCLA in 1985. I was
1985.
1985. Yeah. Did I say?
Would have been with Pio Pico. It's all right. It's okay. You would have been with Pio Pico there.
Yeah. I would have been like 200 years old. Yeah, in 1985, and I was 17 years old. From the projects in East LA, Ramona Gardens, Big Hazard, and I literally was ill prepared when it came to reading and writing. So I was a math major. I was gifted in math. I was highly gifted. So that allowed me to go to UCLA straight out of high school. But when it came to reading and writing, I didn't know how to read and write at the university level. I wasn't even at grade level when I graduated. So I had literally had to teach myself how to write while I was at UCLA to survive and to thrive. And then once I left UCLA and started becoming a community organizer, I started to read the great Latin American writers, like Borges and Marquez and Vargas Llosa. And with Borges, even though I don't like his politics because he was very conservative, he wrote in a way, because I started to write short stories, but I first wanted to learn how to write short stories to write about my experience and that of my family. So he wrote in a way that was very concise, short sentences. In Spanish, for example, they write long sentences. They go on forever and ever to get to the point. It's like, okay, but he's I guess his grandmother was English or American, so he taught people how to write in that way, very short and concise, and these stories. And I found these stories very compelling. So I literally taught myself how to write, where I publish short stories and academic essays and all types of forms of essays. And then I said to myself, when I write, especially for the public, I want to write in a language that they can understand. And especially our young people today, I have a son who's at Amherst College. They don't read long novels. They're not going to sit down and read 300-page books. So I decided to write these short essays to make arguments so that it can be consumed by the public. And the theories and the concepts are deep, and some of them borrowed from other people that I reference. But the style and the way that I write, I do it in a way that it's more like Howard Zinn, where it's accessible to the public.
And every thing about Zinn, and I teach this in my classes, is that every title of the book, every title of the chapter has a specific meaning to it. Mm-hmm. And you can generally understand even by the first paragraph what Zinn is saying. But let's get into the book, because you start off with Juan Gomez Quinonez, very powerful. You start off powerful. And every chapter is powerful, but has a different meaning. You speak a lot about, there's chapters in there about your parents, your mother, your father, your siblings, that experience. And there was a lot of of introspection by you in some of these. Could you summarize some of these articles and what you're trying? So when people buy your book, and please go out and buy the book, again, Defending Latino Immigrant Communities. You can buy it on Amazon. Buy it on Amazon. We want folks to buy your book. But tell us about what some of that introspection you want the viewers to hear and learn, so when they read your book, they're super excited, like I was when I read it.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I talk a lot about Juan Quinonez and also other mentor of mine, Leo Estrada, who also passed away, and you know, the best university in the world apart from Berkeley. And at the end of the day, what I tell people is that we need to look at our own family and our own origins, and then uplift them. In other words, you don't need to have a PhD to be smart or to be great. So to me, the smartest person I've ever met, the hardest worker that I've ever met was my mother. And the thing is that when you have somebody who is illiterate, you know, raised 8 kids. My father was there too, but she was more the driving force. You know, sent 4 of her kids to the best universities in the world. You know, one of them being my brother, Alvaro Huerta, the international acclaimed artist. And that the drive that she had, that a lot of our parents have, that are not giving, they don't receive the credit that they deserve. Like, they don't receive the respect that they deserve. So to me, I wanted to humanize them, but to give them that dignity that they deserve. Just because she cleaned houses or just because she didn't have formal education, it doesn't mean that she wasn't smart. It doesn't mean she wasn't brilliant. It doesn't mean she didn't have like a contribution to give to society. And too often, those of us who grew up in America from Mexican origin or African American or any minority group, we see ourselves that to be recognized, we need to have those degrees. We need to be accomplished. We need to be on TV or what have you. And at the end of the day, by wanting to achieve that too often, then we abandon our own roots, and we abandon like who we are, right? So for me, like I was never ashamed of being Mexican growing up, but I was ashamed of being poor, and to a certain degree, I realized that, you know, like by doing that, I brought shame to my own parents, and I realized that I needed to rectify that and to put them front and center of the argument that when Trump or anybody attacks the Mexicans, they're attacking my family, you know, my parents, and that somebody needs to speak up for them without compromise, without apologies, and that's me. And that, I think, that separates me from other, you know, leaders out there that too often they want to make themselves like they're special because they went to UCLA or they have a law degree or a PhD. But at the end of the day, that wouldn't happen if it wasn't for our people, or the hardest working people in America. In this case, you know, the working class. You know?
Let me read something for our viewers that you have in chapter 5. Once ashamed of my Mexican parents, but not anymore. While I was eventually accepted to UCLA as a freshman majoring in mathematics, I should have been more truthful in my essay. In fact, I did have positive role models, my Mexican immigrant parents. But why didn't I give them credit? Did they represent the so-called burdens of society that many American leaders and white citizens want us to believe? No. And you know, and as I read that, I thought to myself, is this part of that continuity of anti-internalizing anti-Mexicanism that's internal, that we're constantly, you know, being forced to, you know, drop language, drop imagery that is indigenous, that's Mexican, because it's not good? What's your thought?
Yes, definitely, because it's considered inferior. It's considered inferior. So when you're cleaning homes, when you're a garden farm worker like my father was, the Bracero program, it's not considered, you know, prestigious, you know, so that there's shame to it, because we're taught, this is how we were taught in America, and there's also white working class. They feel this too. You know, if you look at Appalachia and other places in rural America, and in the cities too. And that internalization, you want to get away from that. You know, when it was in the summer of '85, the freshman summer program, and it was a seminar, and the professor went around and he was like, okay, you know, what do your parents do? And every single kid, and they were all Latinos and Latinas and African and American and from Africa too. And all of them, because there's diversity in race, but there's not diversity in class, because there's a class issue too. All of them were like, oh, my father's a lawyer, or my dad's a diplomat from Mexico, from Venezuela. And every single one that came, and when it was coming to me, I was like, please don't come to me. You know, like, you know, it was that shame that I wanted to literally run to the ocean, but I didn't know how to swim, so I didn't do that. You know, because we're in West LA. And it was that, like, as if they were murderers or drug dealers or rapists or Trump supporters. You know, it was like, why was I so ashamed of them? You know, and why didn't I want to say that, you know, my mother cleaned homes for a living and my father was on welfare? You know, like, why didn't I do that? And it wasn't until years later that then I started to reflect on this and said that, you know, I need to repent for this, and I shouldn't have felt this way, because I literally was embarrassed of them. And at the end of the day, I was there because of them, because of the example that my mother set for me to be hardworking and to be disciplined and to always look forward. And I always try to teach people, because a lot of students, they feel this way, but they don't know how to articulate it. So when I open myself up, so that when others feel the same way, then they can identify and they could say, yeah, that's right. You know, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm proud of my parents, regardless of their professional status or lack of degrees and so on and so forth.
Two final questions. So you're an organizer. You've organized in labor unions. You've organized your own labor unions, and organizing is a big component of what you're talking about. So in the discussion of how to make sure that Mexican American Latino communities receive the services proportionally to our population numbers. In Los Angeles County, we're above 50% of the population. In California, 40%. But when Latinos make arguments or attempting to get resources, we're kept in very low proportions, right? I believe only 5% of the attorneys in California are Latino. In terms of UCLA did a study about it would take 500 years for Latino medical professionals to be at equity where we need to be. So do Chicano and Latino communities in the various communities need a new strategy in understanding how to articulate our place in the United States in order to fight for those resources and motivate communities?
Oh, definitely. We need to assert ourselves. Unfortunately, for most faculty, they don't have any organizing experience. So they're good at writing, but they're terrible in organizing. So the help is not going to come from the faculty. It's going to come from community members, from the grassroots, from people that organize, or to make that bridge, you know, to make the bridge with those of us who study to those of us who are on the streets. And I'm in a unique position to have one foot in both spaces. For me, unfortunately, those of us of Mexican origin and other Latinos too, the way we were raised, we were taught to be submissive. We were taught to be good boys and good girls, to don't question, haz caso. So that by the time we become adults, we don't challenge the system. Even in the church, we're taught that, you know,
in fact, many of us are hit if we talk back.
Right.
Literally physically assaulted as children if we talk back to authority. Right.
And that's something we can't question. Even simple things like, vamos a comer, you know, lo que haya, you know.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you have to eat whatever is carne asada otra vez.
Or no comes.
Yeah, so we're not taught to question. I mean, this is a self-criticism. We have to be critical.
Right.
Too, right? So we're not taught to question, to challenge the system the way African Americans do, and righteously so. So we need to put our own agenda at the forefront, and we need to do it on a pot of without apologies. I mean, you wrote an excellent essay that Alex Padilla should be the next senator. And even among Latinos, there was like, why? You know, it should be all American, or it should be African American, or it's like, no. In the history of the United States, since the United States was founded or taken over half of Mexico's territory, there's never been a Mexican American senator representing the state of California. And of the senators that are there, they're Cubans. They're not even Mexican Americans. They're other. So that this is the problem, because even within our own, when we're trying to push our own, then there's people that try to like dilute that. So we need to get away from that, and we need to believe in this idea of representation.
So, Dr. Huerta, is there a significant amount of anti-Mexicanism within the Latino community as well, and non-Mexican communities? I mean, what are you seeing?
It might not be anti-Mexicanism, but it might be this idea of like we're all Americans and it doesn't matter, or we're all Latinos, so therefore we end up shooting ourselves in the foot and diluting our own power. Where we are not represented equally.
What I've gotten from a lot of the critics is that as Mexican Americans, to a certain extent, we shouldn't even care about representation anymore, which was contrary to the generation before us. That representation was a big deal. But I'm hearing this from academics who are telling us that representation doesn't matter for us. And even though we went through and we're going through an era of Trump where anti-Mexicanism was very clear, and you articulated the Harvard University professor, that they're very clearly saying Mexican is bad, Mexican is rapist. But a lot of our own academics aren't even articulating that. And I'm not, and so what I'm trying to get to is, do we need to, as people are listening to the discussion between you and I, is to understanding that critical race component and how to articulate race is important to articulating resources in the community. And if you don't know how to articulate why, then folks are going to say you don't need it.
Right, definitely. I mean, it's a question of numbers and demographics. And for those who argue contrary, they just drank the Kool-Aid. They want to be accepted. They want to be accepted by America, and they want to get promoted. So they're just looking out for themselves. And I say this without any consideration of solidarity, because I don't, a lot of times people say, well, I want to be a professor because I want to represent my community. But at the end of the day, you want to represent yourself.
And tenure.
And tenure and promotion, and you're
a lot of it's self-serving.
Self-serving. You want to be at a prestigious university. You want to be promoted. You want to get those grants and publications, and they forget why they were there in the first place, or they were never part of it to begin with.
But Dr. Huerta, here's the frustrating part: is that when community fought for us to be affirmative action, all of these programs, a lot of those professors that think that they got there on their own are literally, and a lot of us saw this as graduate students, at CSUN, where, in the Chicano Studies department, it was different. But, at Claremont, some of the Latino faculty wouldn't talk to you because if you were Mexican American, well, go talk to someone else. Right. So there's a contradiction in academia with regard to representation. So I'm getting a little off topic, but I think when you have a lot of the folks who are extremely intelligent within higher education, but they see no causal connection between what they're doing and the real world organizing, I have to think that's a problem.
Right, definitely. But at the end of the day, the people in the community level, they don't listen to them. They're not being heard. So when these voices speak, they're only speaking to like 5 other people that read their article. And they're misrepresenting themselves, because they're not, at the end of the day, they drank the Kool-Aid. So that's what ends up happening. And this goes for politicians too. So let's not get those off the hook,
Understood and received. But let me ask you a final question. With regard to Mexican American, Latino elected officials, administrators, how does an understanding of Mexican Americanism, right? Because there'll be some of them might be like, "Well, I'm here. I represent who I represent," or you understand represent a business association, a union. How is understanding Mexican Americanism and a lot of the ideas that you talk about with regard to organizing in your book, and how you summarize what occurred during the Trump year. How is it important to them specifically in order to articulate how they should represent our different communities?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, at the end of the day, it has to be this question of parity and the question of where we're at. Okay, we're in California. The majority of the biggest ethnic group is Mexican American. If you look at the LAUSD, the school district, we're about like 80%. You know, so we have to just look at the numbers. Obviously, if you're in Vermont where there's only 2 Mexicans there, you know, in Bernie country, then I could see that. Or maybe if you go to New Jersey, it's maybe Dominican and other groups. So I feel it has to be representative of the population. And if you're an elected official, that's who you're representing, your constituency, right? So I think too often people that, even those of Mexican origin that get elected, and this unfortunately what happened with Villaraigosa, is that they forget where they come from and who they represent, and then they try to represent everybody, and so therefore they represent nobody but themselves. When it comes in general, like elected officials, Latinos and Latinas, I try to, or even other Latino faculty, I try to stay away. I don't really criticize them in my books. Or articles. I focus more like on the Trumps or the pseudo Latinos like Ted Cruz and who's in Cancun right now. And
oh no, he did come back because
he came back because he had to drop him off.
Right, he had to drop him off.
Yeah, it's important to go
like in the carpool lane. You know,
he Ubered over there. So the idea here is that I think people need to be genuine into who they represent and looking at the demographics. So we're in a place where, in Orange County, where there's a high concentration of Vietnamese, for example, I believe in this idea of like self-determination, and that those communities have to be represented by people of Vietnamese origin, because that's who they know the language, they know the culture, they know the needs of that community. So this is an idea of being honest and being connected to the people that you're representing. And the fact of the matter is that in LA, where we're 50% Latino, Latina, the majority Mexican, same thing in California and throughout the Southwest. So we need to, elected officials, people in power, faculty, all need to represent the needs of who of the people that they're serving.
But just to be very clear, as a Mexican American administrator, elected officials, you're not saying that they should only represent Mexican Americans or Latinos. I'm assuming you're saying fairly represent everyone, but understand that you also have a special responsibility to the Mexican American Latino community.
Yes, definitely, and then focus on the particular needs and with that community. Yes, no, I'm not saying that it should be exclusive or it should be like this nationalism that we see with white nationalism, but it's more to be cognizant of the fact that there's a particular case in the particular history when it comes to Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and that needs to be considered. Take COVID, for example. There's this idea that's floating out there that everybody's affected by COVID. That's true and that's false at the same time. It's true that we're all affected, that rich people also get it and they also die from it. But disproportionately is Black and brown people. And if you look in Los Angeles, we see a high concentration, probably the highest concentration right now of people who contracting it and dying it are people like in Boa Heights. Or if you go to the Valley, like in Van Nuys and places like that. So, or Pacoima. So within that, and those are Mexican American population. So you have, when you have this reality, there needs to be a focus on that. So there needs to be, like, these groups need to prioritize because they're disproportionately being impacted. So this is what I'm getting at with that. So if we look at, when we dilute the numbers, when we put, okay, everybody's Latino, the problem with that is that the numbers might not be representative of that. right? So let's say UCLA. UCLA admits, I think they're admitting now like 12, 14% Latino, Latina. But LA is like over 50% Latino, Latina. So we should be like
75% of all Latinos are Mexican.
Right. So we should, but the numbers don't reflect that. So to them, let's say of those 12, 15%, let's say 50% are from Venezuela or from Cuba or Cuban Americans. So that's diluting our numbers. That it's not representing the population of Los Angeles, of the state. On a related note, in Hollywood, we don't have any directors. I mean, we have a few, Esparza and Nava, but they're marginalized. They're not given the opportunities that other directors are. Instead, we're being imposed by these Mexican directors that come to the United States, like these big name directors that I love all their movies, but it's not the same thing.
They're not Mexican American.
Right, they're not Mexican American. They don't have that experience. So it's like Barack Obama's dad. He came from Africa, but he was a scholar and he was an elite, and he came over here. So it's not the same thing somebody grows up in South LA. And so for me, I want representation for the black male from South LA. And that's being diluted when you include within these communities people from outside of that community, because they can say, yes, we have representation of Latinos. Antonio Banderas, he's a Spanish American. He's not a Latino.
No.
Right? So he's Spanish American, but this is how they conflate it. And those that are in power, they're able to use them as tokens and say, I don't know what you're talking about. We have Antonio Banderas here, and we have Penelope Cruz, but they're not even Latinos. They're Spanish. They're Spanish Americans. They're European Americans. So this is why labels are important. And those that argue that labels don't matter are ignorant and are historically, they suffer from a historical amnesia, where they forget what they want to forget, remember what they want to remember, because it was people of Mexican origin that fought for places like at UCLA, like in Northridge and other places that we have in the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s and 70s, that we have more representation from these communities. So now that they have their degrees, they turn around and say, no, we're all American. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters, because why do you think you were there in the first place? So we have to get away from this idea of individualism, and those of us who have reached a level of success in America to be able to reconnect with our roots and not feel that we're successful until our entire community is successful.
Dr. Alvaro Huerta, Cal Poly Pomona. Viewers, please buy his book. It's an excellent book. I'll be using it for some of my classes. Defending Latina and Latino Immigrant Communities, the xenophobic era of Trump and beyond. Gracias. Un abrazo. Viewers, please subscribe below. But Dr. Huerta, is there anything that you would like to say to viewers before we end?
Well, I just want to thank you, and I know your brother's also a PhD. It's amazing to have 2 PhDs in the family, and I'm pretty sure you have more that I don't know about it.
One engineer, another educator.
No, that's fantastic.
Four boys.
That's fantastic. I'm sure your parents did a great job with all of you. And anybody, I support anybody and everybody that defends our communities, and not just Mexican American. It could be Central American and others that have people from Honduras. So for me, it's always been about looking at people as human beings first, and having that understanding and that respect that we should all be treated as human beings with dignity and respect. And when one group is attacked, then we all need to be in solidarity. So I'm in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and any group, LGBTQ, that is marginalized, discriminated against. And at the end of the day, we need to come together and to bring these forces together in terms of Black and brown. Stop fighting each other, stop competing against each other, and fight against a common enemy, which is white supremacy in America.
Thank you very much, Alvaro Huerta. Have a good rest of your day.
Gracias.
Okay, we're out. Fernando, did we stay on time?